And welcome to the Progress Kemp session here at the Application Architecture Summit, where we'll see the latest innovations in web application firewalls to protect your apps and APIs, those that are critical to drive your multi-cloud and hybrid apps environments. Our speaker this morning is Andrew Howe, Senior Product Manager, Progress Kemp. Andrew, welcome.
Happy to be here, Vince.
Absolutely. We're glad to have Andrew with us this morning. He joins us from the UK, in fact, this morning. He is a web application firewall expert with expertise in load balancing. That's going to be on great display this morning. He's an author and educator that helps enterprises deploy and configure app security solutions. His session this morning is entitled Defending Web Apps and APIs, a Flexible Web Application Firewall with LoadMaster. In the world of multi-cloud and hybrid apps, Andrew's going to explain why any of your public-facing web apps and APIs need the protection of a WAF. He'll reveal the best ways to ensure how your WAF can provide an always-on defensive layer in a consistent and repeatable way, most importantly, and we'll get a great demo and see how Progress Kemp LoadMaster makes it easy to configure your WAF and customize your API defense rules. And just a quick reminder before we begin, you can download today's slides. Just click the big red button in the view area. And we've also got some other valuable downloads and even access to a free trial for you, all just one click away. So feel free to click away on those. And we also love to have you interact with our speakers. So to type a question, just go to that submit a question box. We'll get it right to Andrew. Andrew, with that, thanks again for joining us. Tell us about defending web apps and APIs.
Happy to. So just a quick agenda. What are we going to talk about today? I want to cover three main topics here. Firstly, when do you need to have a WAF? I'll then talk a bit about deploying a WAF and some of the practical considerations. And I'll also talk in depth about defending APIs and web applications, specifically with the Progress Kemp LoadMaster appliance. So the problem statement that we're dealing with is, if you put something nice on the internet, someone will come along and try to make it terrible. And this, unfortunately, rings true whether you're a non-profit or a business, regardless of how big or small your organization is. And a couple of years ago, I worked with a small local telephone company, and they found that their web application was being consistently attacked by someone who was just flipping through all of the local phone numbers in the phone book and brute forcing trying to attack their web application. So it doesn't matter, even if you're a very small local company, you're still at the mercy of people on the public internet. But on the flip side of that, making your services available is a good thing. If you put stuff out there on the public internet, you get more eyeballs, more users, and that means more customers and more business. So it's a balancing act. We want to make our apps and services available, but we want to mitigate the risks associated with doing that. So by putting something on the public internet, you're exposing your APIs and your web apps to the background noise of the internet, scanners out there on the public net, and also, unfortunately, those active attackers who are trying to do our applications and services harm. So it's very much a question of risk management and mitigating those risks as best as we can. So here's the scenario for you. So imagine you're launching a new service or web application. You've been working on this for a while and it's ready to rock and roll. Your public go live is imminently coming up and you're ready to start exposing your service to the public internet. That's exciting, but it's also a little bit scary and it can raise a series of questions. Do we have enough layers of security in place to protect the service that we're about to start publishing? Specifically, do we have a web application firewall, a WAF, in place? And there can be compliance and policy questions around this as well. For example, if we're dealing with financial data or credit card data, then the PCI DSS standard comes into force and it states you must have a WAF in place protecting your infrastructure. But where should the WAF live? Does it live in the cloud? Does it live on-prem? What if I've got a hybrid scenario? How does that work? Do we need more than one WAF? How does that work? Do we need multiple WAFs to protect our applications and services? So lots of questions to consider. So if we take a step back and we think about defense in depth, so the classic concept whereby we have something valuable that we want to defend as best we can. So it could be a service, it could be an API, or some web applications. To defend that, what we want to do is use multiple independent layers of security, multiple layers of defense. So the idea is that if one or more of our defensive layers becomes compromised or unavailable, that's not a problem because we still have multiple additional layers of defense actively providing protection and still in place. So in the context of a modern web service or web application, a WAF, a web application firewall, is one example of one of those key defensive layers that we have in place to protect our infrastructure. So let's talk a little bit about firewalls, because this is a question that very often comes up. So what's the difference between a traditional network firewall and a web application firewall? So a traditional network firewall, we're looking at IP, TCP, UDP, and friends. So we're dealing with things like source addresses, destination addresses, source and destination port numbers. Very much we're working at the network level, and we can do some simple allow and deny logic on that basis. However, that's not entirely sufficient in the modern world anymore. So that's where web application firewalls come into the picture. So a web application firewall, a WAF, is looking at web traffic. It's looking at HTTP. So we're working at the top of the application layer of the networking stack here. We're looking and we're monitoring and inspecting the content of the traffic that we see flowing through. And by doing that, by looking at the content of the HTTP traffic, it gives us the ability to look for malicious traffic. We're looking for bad patterns, and we can proactively block traffic that we want to keep out of our web application and out of our infrastructure. So both a network firewall and a web application firewall are critically important. They're different but complementary technologies. And in a modern context, it's vitally important to have both in place to provide two different levels of protection. So what kind of deployments will benefit from having a WAF in place? The short answer is any deployment of a web application will benefit from having a WAF. But specifically, I want to look at two scenarios. So let's look at new deployments. So let's imagine we're rolling out a new web application or a new web service. That will absolutely benefit from having a WAF in place as early in the production cycle as possible. So if we're developing something new, we absolutely want to afford it the protection of a web application firewall from as early on as possible. But in addition to that, let's look at legacy applications. So older technologies are still around, and we have to, in many cases, live with them for many years, and we have to keep them as secure as we possibly can for business reasons. So let's say, for example, you have a legacy app and you've had to do a lift and shift to put a legacy application perhaps in a public cloud to make it more easily accessible to your customers or your internal users. A legacy application is also very much ripe for protection with a WAF. If you're doing such a lift and shift exercise, then you absolutely want to protect that legacy application with a web application firewall. Again, to protect it with an additional layer of defense. So let's look at the context of deploying a WAF in front of an application or a service. So on one hand, we have our users, and on the other hand, we have our application service, our infrastructure that's providing our service. The vast majority of our users are going to be legitimate, genuine users who just want to use our application or our service. However, a small percentage of traffic will be from attackers, people who are sending intentionally malicious or intentionally malformed traffic. And that can be for a variety of reasons, but fundamentally they wish to do our service harm or to cause unexpected behavior from our application. So we want to try and deal with that threat as best as we can. So we can do that by putting a WAF in the middle of the traffic path. So again, with our users on one hand and our infrastructure and our servers on the other hand, we put the WAF in the middle of the mix here. And the WAF, again, is monitoring that web traffic. It's proactively looking for and proactively blocking malicious, bad traffic. So the traffic from the attackers is stopped at the WAF layer before it ever manages to make its way to the application servers on the back end. I like to use the analogy that a WAF is like a suit of armor. It's providing a layer of defense. So when you put on a suit of armor, that doesn't make you invincible. A suit of armor is not a perfect defensive measure, but if you should be unfortunate enough to find yourself on the receiving end of something sharp and pointy, you're going to be very grateful to have that armor, that additional layer of defense in place to protect you. And a WAF is very similar. It's an extra layer of defense. It's not a silver bullet. A WAF isn't a perfect solution, but it's an important additional layer of protection. And in a real-world deployment, as we saw earlier, a WAF is one of many different layers that are working together in concert to provide a full defensive posture. So I'd like to talk now some specifics about the LoadMaster WAF offering. So first of all, what is LoadMaster? So the Progress Kemp LoadMaster is an application delivery controller, or put simply, it's a load balancer. And like any good load balancer, it helps with your application's availability, scalability, so you can add additional servers, performance, we can do things like TLS, SSL offloading, but crucially for us here today, security. It assists with improving the security posture of your web applications and APIs. And a core component of that is having a Web Application Firewall, a WAF, built into the LoadMaster appliance. It's very common to see load balancers and WAFs bundled together. There's a very big overlap between the feature sets and the requirements of load balancers and the requirements and feature sets of a WAF. So it's very common to see them living together. They're very natural partners here. So what environments can you put the LoadMaster into? So traditional on-prem environments as a hardware or a virtual appliance is absolutely supported. Hybrid cloud, if you've got on-prem but you also have some of your infrastructure somewhere in a cloud, also absolutely supported. Multi-cloud environments, if you're splitting some of your workloads across different public and private clouds, again, that's absolutely fine for the LoadMaster to support. And also microservices. So we have a Kubernetes ingress controller, which can also support modern microservice architectures. So the key here is flexibility. The LoadMaster is very flexible in where and how it can be deployed. So once you have a WAF configuration and some WAF rules that you're happy with and that work with your application, you're then free to deploy the same WAF infrastructure across the board. So wherever your application happens to live. So for example, if you have an instance of your application internally, maybe a QA or a development environment on the premises, absolutely fine. You can spin up a virtual LoadMaster and deploy your WAF rules. Let's say, for example, you have production in a public cloud or maybe in a remote data center somewhere. Again, absolutely fine. You can deploy the same LoadMaster image to the cloud or to a remote data center and use exactly the same WAF config and WAF rules. So you're flexible to deploy across multiple different architectures, but keeping the same WAF configuration across the board. So it's flexible, but also offers a great deal of consistency. So the LoadMaster Web Application Firewalls, the WAF stack looks like we have our users on one side, our application servers, the infrastructure on the other side, and the LoadMaster sits in the middle. So by sitting in the middle, we're able to inspect both the inbound requests and to inspect those, but also the outbound response traffic from the servers back to the clients. We can also inspect that as well. So the LoadMaster is acting as an additional layer of defense, and it gives us an extra layer of application hardening. The LoadMaster features some generic detection rules. So these are WAF rules that cover the OWASP top 10 categories. So things like cross-site scripting detection, SQL injection, remote command execution, these very common everyday types of attacks that we want to detect and to block so that they never manage to make their way to our application servers. We're also able to adjust the sensitivity and aggressiveness of the WAF stack on the LoadMaster. So typically you'd start off with a more relaxed WAF setting to make sure that you're not blocking legitimate traffic, but as your confidence in the solution grows over time and you manage to improve the configuration over time, you can start to increase the aggressiveness and increase the sensitivity of the WAF engine on the LoadMaster. That means you're able to detect attacks more quickly and you're able to detect a wider array of attacks. It's also worth mentioning that it's a fully tunable WAF instance. So when we have false positives, so when legitimate traffic causes WAF rules to match in error, we call that a false positive, and we want to avoid those as much as possible. And to do that, we have a fully tunable WAF solution so that you can prevent false positives from occurring. So looking specifically at the API defense side of things. So the LoadMaster is able to pass and validate JSON requests. So if you're dealing with a RESTful API, you're almost certainly looking at JSON requests. So we can pass and validate those. But also, if you're dealing perhaps with more of a legacy application, we can also look at XML payloads. We can pass and validate those as well. We can start to build up policies. For example, you can define which HTTP methods are you willing to allow into your application. And you can do that on an application-wide basis or on a per endpoint basis if you want to be very granular. We can also build up allow and deny lists. So let's say we have some of our API endpoints are publicly accessible and we want to allow anybody to access those. On the other side, we might have some privileged and administrative endpoints. So maybe we want to lock those down so that only internal networks are able to access those privileged endpoints. So we can start building up allow and deny list policies on a per endpoint basis. Access control as well. Let's say that legitimate access to our API will always require either a JSON web token or an API key. Then what we can do is we can look for the presence of those tokens, and if any are missing, then we can immediately reject the request as bogus and stop it from proceeding any further than the WAF. And we can also do input validation. This is quite interesting, especially if we know that it's our own API and we know what kind of input to inspect. We can start to look at how many bytes of input are we willing to accept in a request. How many arguments are we willing to accept for a request? And we can even go as far as doing full XML schema validation. So again, if we have an XML-based app, maybe a legacy app, we can create an XML schema to granularly control what kind of input are we willing to accept as valid and legitimate. So underpinning all of this, we also have a set of generic WAF rules, and those on the LoadMaster are based on the OWASP CRS WAF rules. So this is an industry standard set of WAF rules, and it provides protection for a wide range of common attacks. Things like HTTP protocol violations, file inclusion attacks, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, and much more. So I'd now like to show you a little bit of a demo of how easy it is to get up and running with the LoadMaster WAF. So this is the front page of the Progress Kemp LoadMaster. The first thing I'm going to do is go to Virtual Services in the top left here, and I'm going to click Add New. I want to create a test virtual service for this demo. So under Virtual Address, this is the IP address that my clients will be connecting to. So I'm going to use the IP 192.168.2.150. Under port, I'm going to use port 80. I could use port 443 and set up a certificate to use HTTPS or a self-signed certificate, but for this demo I'm going to keep things simple. I'm going to stick to plaintext HTTP on port 80. So I now click the button Add this virtual service. What I do now is I use the bottom tab here, Real Servers, and I'm going to add as a real server a test Debian Apache box that I've set up for this demonstration. So I click on Add New to add a new real server, and I add the address of the IP address of the Debian box I've set up, so 192.168.2.30, and I click Add this real server to confirm. And I click OK on the dialog box. I don't have any other servers I want to add at this time, so I'm going to click the back button to return to the previous page. So I'll get rid of the Real Servers tab. What I now want to do is come up here to the WAF tab. So to enable the WAF engine, all I need to do is check the enabled box here, and immediately the WAF service is enabled. What I'm going to do now is come down to the Advanced Settings button here. So the top option here is quite interesting. So this is Inspect HTTP Post Request Bodies. And I mentioned earlier that for the case of an API, or indeed any application or website, I may want to inspect the request body content as it comes through. That's in addition to things like the request headers, the URI, the query string, and so forth. So I can do that by checking this box here. And for most scenarios, you're going to want to enable this checkbox. And it also automatically enables JSON parsing and XML parsing for me as well. So I'm now going to press the back button to return to the previous page. And the last thing I'm going to do here is look at this setting here, anomaly scoring threshold. So this is how we configure the sensitivity of the WAF service. So by default it's set to a score threshold of 100. Now that's very high. That means that a request would have to trigger many individual WAF rules in order to be potentially blocked. So I want to increase the sensitivity of the WAF service for this demo. So I'm going to set the scoring threshold all the way down to a score of 5. Now a score of 5 is a magic number here because that means if any single WAF rule is triggered, that will immediately cause a block, which makes it very secure, and that's a good goal to have if you're doing this in production. But for testing purposes as well, it means if I trigger a single rule, I can immediately demonstrate a blocking event. I'm now going to return to the home screen here. And on the home page, you can see we have this WAF status box. So this gives us some simple, at-a-glance metrics that gives us an idea of what the WAF is currently doing on the LoadMaster. So the two numbers of most interest to us are this first one here, total requests handled. So that tells us how many HTTP requests have been processed through the WAF engine so far. And the second number here, total events, this tells us what is the total number of blocking events that have taken place. So how many of those requests have been processed and have resulted in a block being sent to the client. So now what I'm going to do is open up a terminal and we're going to send some simple test requests through the WAF stack to see it in action. So I'll start by sending a simple plain HTTP request to our virtual service here. So I should expect this to go through the WAF stack without issue and to get a response. So if I send that, and you'll see I get a response from my Debian server, and that request has gone through the WAF without issue. So it didn't trigger any rules, it wasn't blocked, and the response was sent back from the server just fine. You'll also see in the WAF status we have one total request that's been handled, which matches with the reality of what we've just tested. Now what we're going to do is send another request, but this time we're going to send a JSON request. And we'll send a request with a very simple JSON payload. So we'll say foo is bar. So nothing unusual or malicious looking there. So we'll send this request off, and again we should expect this to pass through the WAF engine and to get a response from the real server without any problems. And once again, we see we get the response from the backend server, which is what we expected. And also our total requests handled has gone up to 2. This time I'm going to send a request, but I'm going to insert something that looks a little bit malicious. So I'll send another JSON payload, but I'm going to send it with PowerShell.exe. So I send this request, and now you can see we're getting a 403 forbidden response. So this is coming from the WAF on the LoadMaster. So this request was stopped before it reached the backend server, and the LoadMaster WAF sent back a 403 forbidden response. And on the WAF status over here, we can see total requests handled has been incremented to 3, and we have total events is now 1. So that tells us we've had one blocking event in the WAF. And again, if we change that from PowerShell.exe to something like /bin/bash in Unix land, if we send this, then again, also this has been forbidden. And again, total events has gone up to 2 to tell us we've now had 2 blocking events on the WAF stack. So you can see just how quick it was to get a fully featured WAF engine up and running on a LoadMaster virtual service. If we were now to put a full website or API or web service behind our LoadMaster with the WAF enabled, that service would be afforded the protection of a full WAF. And following on from that demo, I'd like to show you some of our LoadMaster 360 offering. LoadMaster 360 enables what we call our enhanced WAF ability. It's a software as a service solution that you can hook up to your LoadMaster to provide increased abilities with WAFs and increased ability with log parsing. So it gives you the ability, for example, to have a graphical dashboard that shows you which IP addresses are hitting which parts of your application, how many requests are being blocked, how many requests have been scanned in total, and it also gives you some automated abilities to parse your logs. So one of the biggest problems with getting a WAF up and running is in the early stages, you have to go through the log files to ensure you've addressed any false positives. So again, a false positive is a legitimate request that's being blocked in error. LM360, our SaaS offering, if you add this to your LoadMaster, it has smart filter capabilities that's able to parse thousands or tens of thousands of log lines in order to pick out the key messages that an operator needs to give their full attention to. So it massively reduces the bar and reduces the barrier to entry for getting up to speed in adding a WAF to your application security posture. I hope you've enjoyed what you've seen here today, and I hope it's given you some interest to go and download our free trial. So the LoadMaster appliance can be downloaded and added to your environment, and we'd be very happy to have a conversation with you to discuss how best LoadMaster can defend your applications and APIs. So please go to our website, download a free trial, and get in touch with us today. That concludes my formal remarks for today, and with that, I'd like to throw it back to Vance.
Andrew, thank you, and thank you for a really great and efficient look at the science and status of WAFs for the enterprise today, and especially looking at those really key and intuitive features for LoadMaster. Really great session.
Thank you very much.
Andrew, also great session to the point that you percolated some questions in here. So with your permission, let's go to some questions.
Please do.
Let's start with this one, Andrew. It really caught my eye. WAFs have a reputation for being difficult to configure and maintain. How can this be made quicker and easier? Does Progress LoadMaster have any suggestions or even features to help us?
That's a great question. This is a particular challenge, I feel, for small and medium-sized organizations. So while it's true that everybody could benefit from the protection of a WAF, if that only becomes accessible to larger organizations that have the time and the resources to do it, then it becomes quite a challenge. So I think firstly, there's a question of consistency, right? If LoadMaster, where you can deploy the same device across multiple different platforms, that makes it easier to get to grips with one WAF solution across the board. So you only have to train your staff on one particular platform. If you compare that, for example, to if you were to use a different WAF solution on-prem versus a different WAF solution for each individual cloud provider, you're very quickly racking up lots of different systems that you have to educate your security staff on how to use. You have to translate your rule logic towards different kinds of systems, and that becomes a massive headache. So I feel like having one consistent platform like LoadMaster and being able to repeat that across lots of different platforms is a really intuitive and easy way to configure and maintain WAFs. Also with our LoadMaster 360 integration, where we have that smart log analysis, that massively reduces the burden on security operators. So LoadMaster 360 is able to pick out, say, a couple of dozen specific log entries of interest. If you compare that with having to go through thousands or tens of thousands of lines of logs, it's a massively reduced time towards getting to implementing your WAF. So it makes it much quicker and much easier to configure and maintain.
Excellent, Andrew. In fact, when you mentioned LoadMaster 360, I've got a quick question here about that. This attendee says, I'd like to hear more about LoadMaster 360. Just to be clear, does it offer both UI for visibility as well as a configuration or console control for LoadMaster operations?
Excellent question. So yes, we do have dashboarding and metrics that we expose to make it much, much easier and much quicker to control and maintain a fleet of LoadMasters. Configuration control, that's something that's imminently coming to the platform. And when that's in as a separate piece, that will be an excellent addition to enable you to both maintain and configure an entire fleet of LoadMasters. It also gives you really quick at-a-glance metrics. So you can log into LoadMaster 360 and see, hey, what's this LoadMaster doing? How much load is it under? How many requests has it blocked on the WAF today? And you can very quickly get a sense of, do I need to provision additional WAFs? Do I need to assign additional resources to these LoadMasters? Is it under heavy load? Am I being attacked? Do I need to take some action? So it's a very good way to get very quick metrics in terms of what's happening and what requires your attention.
That is really awesome, Andrew. And just to be clear on that, the LoadMaster 360, this is not simply a log report that I look at. This is real-time data that I can adjust as it's happening, right?
Yes, that's correct. Specifically with the WAF information as well, that gives you a live update of which IP addresses are you seeing hitting your box, which parts of the world are you seeing requests coming from. For example, if you suddenly see a specific IP address is sending tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of requests, that makes you think, hang on a minute, this looks like it's unusual behavior. Maybe I need to pick up the phone, talk to my firewall team and ask them to start putting some blocks in place. So it gives you a live readout of what's happening and you can take immediate action to shore up your defenses.
Fantastic. Let's take a step back and talk a little bit about this layered architecture approach, Andrew, you mentioned. The speaker mentioned a layer security approach to protection. Precisely where does LoadMaster fit into our layered security architecture? And I know, Andrew, you talked about the middle of the traffic path. Maybe you can walk us through where you would put it and if people need multiples.
Yes is the short answer. You can put it in the middle of the traffic path. That's where it needs to go, as long as the LoadMaster is able to route traffic from the clients and then route that traffic to the backend servers. The LoadMaster is very flexible in terms of where it can be positioned. Traditionally, the load balancer would be sitting either directly in front of or alongside your application servers, sometimes physically in the same rack as your application servers, or it will live on the same hypervisor as your application servers. So traditionally, that's the simplest approach to take, but it's very flexible. And as I say, as long as it's able to route traffic between the clients and to the backend servers as well, in theory, it can live anywhere you want. So you can segregate it into a specific, secure, locked down network. So like a traditional DMZ style affair, where the LoadMaster is sitting on its own in a more secure network, and then it's allowing through certain traffic to the backend. You could even go as far as putting it in a completely different site. So you could have your LoadMaster on-prem and your real servers in the cloud, or vice versa. Your LoadMaster could be in the cloud and you could have your real servers in a different cloud, or your real servers are on-prem. So it really is as flexible to meet whatever kind of needs your architecture may throw up at you.
Yeah, that's really great. We're certainly getting beyond the traditional edge and port 80 sort of conversation with LoadMaster. You get a lot of flexibility there.
Absolutely. Flexibility is the watchword here. We see a whole variety of different kinds of architectures, and as we move forward, increasingly we see architectures split up across different platforms, some of it in the cloud, some of it in data centers. So the more flexible your solution can be, the more likely it is to provide you real, tangible, and quick benefits to your application and your business.
Really awesome. Let's pivot to APIs. We still have a few more minutes here. And Andrew, this has been a great Q&A, by the way. Many of our developers, even if they've moved on from building direct applications, still are in the API world. So this I thought was a really good question. And it simply says, in 2025, where does Progress see the biggest trends in API attacks? And where is Progress focusing its API and web app defense?
Another great question. APIs, as soon as you open them up to the public internet, you still see your traditional scanners, you still see a lot of bots hitting them, a lot of scrapers, and increasingly in the world of AI, we're seeing a lot of generative AI scrapers and bots as well. Let's say, for example, you have an API in the public cloud and suddenly you're inundated with a deluge of AI-based scrapers or AI bots that are suddenly draining your resources. That's taking valuable resources and time away from your legitimate customers and users. So we're seeing a lot more bots and scrapers. It's a problem that's not going away anytime soon. And it's increasingly important to try and tighten your application defense as much as possible to weed out irrelevant traffic, to try and deny traffic that's taking away time and resource from your legitimate customers. So that continues to be an area of focus for us here at Progress. But also, again, talking about the security aspects of things, even in a private cloud environment, it's absolutely imperative to make sure that you're as locked down and as secure as possible, particularly with any sensitive kind of information or sensitive APIs and services. It's imperative to have a WAF defensive layer in place. So having something like LoadMaster in place in public and private cloud is absolutely key, both for security, scalability, and of course availability, making sure that if you have outages in some of your web application servers and clusters, you're able to route around those and send traffic to the right place to make sure that you keep your service up as much as you possibly can.
Andrew, this has been a really great Q&A and a really interesting conversation. You're triggering a little light bulb to go off here. This dual role that LoadMaster can play with both WAF, but also this load balancing capability, seems like it would help folks address that tricky balance between SLAs on the one hand and protection on the other.
Absolutely. And one of the big advantages of an appliance like the Progress Kemp LoadMaster is that we're able to do all of those things in one single appliance. So that makes it much easier, especially for small and medium-sized businesses. It's much easier to train your staff on a single appliance that's going to meet all of those needs. In terms of SLAs, it's often the case that if we're providing some sort of service or we're some sort of service provider, we may well have contractual obligations to keep a certain number of nines of uptime for our services and applications. So having a load balancer in place is crucial to making sure that is the case. So I can speak a little bit about some experience in the field with this. So I've done a lot of work with telecoms providers in the past. And in that kind of business where you're dealing with telecoms, it has to be instant, it has to be real time, and you cannot afford slowness to be introduced into the traffic path. That's simply a killer. If you've got a customer base and they're paying for some sort of telecom service, they will not accept slowness or downtime. It's completely a no-go. So you need to have something robust in place, like a LoadMaster, to, on the one hand, keep services available and ensure uptime at all times, but also to add that defensive layer without introducing a lot of latency. So the system we use in the LoadMaster, it's an industry standard WAF stack. It's based on industry standard technologies, which are well understood. They're very hardened and very thoroughly battle tested in the field. And we've tested it internally as well. And we know that it doesn't add a significant amount of latency.
Andrew, this has been such a great session. I can see why your reputation for being an educator in this app and API protection space is just so well deserved. Just before we go, one other big topic that comes up, it's certainly all over the internet and among app developers, this idea of AI and intelligence embedded in a lot of these devices. What kind of trends or what effects does Progress see for AI, for WAF and load balancing?
That's a very topical question, isn't it? It's certainly the case that services and applications and APIs can often be hit by AI-based scrapers and bots, which can be very expensive. If you suddenly see that your API is being bombarded with a deluge of traffic from AI-based bots and scrapers, you can start to rack up a very big bill, especially if you're in the cloud. If you're in the public cloud and you're suddenly serving hundreds of thousands of unexpected requests from your APIs because of bots and AI gen bots, that can become very expensive. So you want to try and avoid that. So it's important to start looking at patterns of what these bots are accessing. You can do things like rate limiting as well on the LoadMaster. So put in limits in terms of how many connections can be accessed per second. But also with AI enhanced attacks, right? We're seeing attackers using generative AI to try and come up with sneaky ways around traditional protections and traditional WAF rules. So it's important that we keep on top of the latest research and techniques. So we need to try and combat the threats from AI and to try and make sure that they don't incur large bills and to make sure that any of these AI enhanced attacks are thwarted as quickly as possible and that they don't make it to your backend web servers, which in theory might be less hardened to AI attacks. So at Progress, AI is important to us here, and we're doing our utmost to bring AI-powered products across our portfolio, and that includes the LoadMaster appliance and the LoadMaster WAF, particularly with relation to looking at log files and trying to make it as easy and as quick to get set up with a meaningful WAF protection as possible, and to try and thwart these AI-based attacks and to try and nip a lot of this in the bud as quickly as possible so that customers and end users aren't affected by the negatives of AI and AI-based attacks.
Andrew, this has been a terrific session. You've really hit the trifecta. A great session, a really good demo, and boy, what a informative Q&A. Thank you very much. Before we leave, however, we do want to get your advice for one last thing. We like to have our attendees engage with all of our presenters here at the Application Architecture Summit. Can you suggest a couple of next steps that people can take to easily learn more about the LoadMaster, maybe even get hands-on with the technology?
Absolutely. We have a great free trial, so you can download our free trial appliance today and have a play with LoadMaster, see if it works for you, see how it fits into your environment. And yeah, as I say, reach out, don't be shy, get in touch, and let's have a conversation to see how we can help you to meet your application and security needs with LoadMaster.
Really wonderful, really wonderful. Andrew Howe, Senior Product Manager, Progress Kemp, thanks very much for a really great overview and drill down into Progress LoadMaster. And keynote to our audience, many of these resources are right here in the breakout room, those links below, including the link to the free trial. And quick note here, as you can tell, there is a ton of innovation already in the product as well as the future roadmap that Andrew was able to share a little bit about. Here's a slide that will take you directly to the LoadMaster website where you can learn more, go drill down into many of the aspects. Just download Andrew's slides this morning. All these links will be live. So thanks again to Andrew for his great interaction. And audience, thank you for some really great questions.